Hello and welcome, my name's Andy. This week in our flipped preaching we're going to have a look at Matthew 18 verses 21 to 35. Really interesting passage, and one that doesn't really make sense at first glance, but I'm going to hopefully try and unpick it a bit and see how it's really good news, and also see how we can use this as a way to understand prayer better. Okay, first off, the passage we're going to look at is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, and like all other Gospels, like the other three as well, it's kind of a patchwork. It's been put together and stitched together, so it's made up of a series of little chunks, which are like the patches, which are stories and poems, maybe things from their church practice, so some liturgy as well. It's made of lots of little patches which have been stitched together to make a whole. Okay, that's what it's like. So the person who put this together, which we call Matthew, added connecting sentences, introduced bits, tied it together, and also added some conclusions to neaten up the chunks. Okay, so it wasn't written from scratch, it was collated, it was brought together, stitched together from all sorts of little bits that he had to hand. Okay, now, I don't know, you might not like that understanding of what the gospel is. Perhaps you'd prefer it if Matthew sat down with a blank sheet of parchment and just wrote it from scratch, but that's not what we've got. The gospels are patchworks. Okay, that's a little sort of introduction, and we'll see later why that's important. Okay, so the passage starts off with a little chunk, a little patch, Jesus talking to Peter, and the whole question is about how many times we forgive people. When people have done us wrong, when people have hurt us, have sinned against us, how many times should we forgive them? And Jesus' answer is basically unlimited. You never stop. You keep on forgiving. That's the first patch. And then, okay, so you got that? Forgiveness has to be unlimited. That's what we're commanded to do. We can't hold grudges. No matter how many times people keep on hurting us, we have to forgive. Now, that doesn't excuse bad behaviour. Sometimes that forgiveness does involve an element of helping the person to see what they're doing wrong. It's not just accepting abuse, but we have to be forgiving. Okay, then we have a parable, which Matthew has stitched onto it to illustrate the point. But as we'll see, it kind of doesn't work in some ways. Okay, so this is the parable. We have a king. Matthew sets up this king as being a very rich and powerful person, and we have a servant. And it turns out that the servant has been dealing badly with the money, and the king meets him and demands that he repays his debt. Now, the debt that's been built up is 10,000 talents. So just a word about the numbers. This basically means infinity. 10,000 was the biggest number that they had in the day. So by saying 10,000, that was like saying infinity. A talent was the biggest denomination of money. That was the biggest amount of money. So 10,000 talents, it means everything. It means all the wealth, everything that there is. Just to give a sense of scale, Herod, the king who was ruling in that time, we think had an income of about 900 talents a year from all of the lands that he possessed. So for this king to demand 10,000 talents from this servant, it's kind of unreasonable. It's too much, it's over the top. But the amazing thing is, the king forgives the servant his debt. The 10,000 talents is written off. The king shows an unlimited, abundant grace to the servant. Okay, then, in the next scene, the servant who's been forgiven this vast amount, been shown this abundant, unlimited grace, meets another servant, and this one owes this one 100 denarii, which is a much, much, much smaller amount of money, but it's still a lot of money. To the poor peasants who would be hearing and reading this story, that was more money than they would ever dream to see in one go. So it's much less than the king forgave, but it's still a lot. And this servant refuses to let this debt go. Okay, then the king hears, calls this servant back. Now this is where the parable gets a bit sticky, because the king meets the servant who he forgave everything, hears that this servant's been mean to this one, and the question is, does this king forgive? Remember, Jesus said that we should forgive unlimited amount of times, 70 times 7. Does this king forgive? And the answer is no, he doesn't. And this one is thrown into prison until he can repay. So what's going on there? What has happened? This king starts off giving this abundant amount of grace, but then at the second offence doesn't forgive. So what's going on? What's going on? Now, people have argued about this for a long time, because it doesn't seem to make sense. And there are kind of two ideas of what might be going on. Firstly, we normally assume in a parable that when there's a king or a ruler, that the king represents God. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't. But we've kind of got used to that idea that kings in parables mean God, but it doesn't necessarily. So maybe, this is the first option, maybe the king in this parable goes some way towards what God's like, but by falling short illustrates how much better God is. So that's the first idea. Maybe the king isn't actually as good as God would be. The king doesn't illustrate the way God works, God who forgives indefinitely. Second theory is that maybe the bit at the end with the king facing up to the servant again and not forgiving him, that might be Matthew's stitching. The parable might have ended earlier, and Matthew might have added that bit on at the end as a way of rounding it up, as concluding it. We'll see later as we go on through Matthew that Matthew likes the idea of warnings. He's really into threatening and warning his congregation. So maybe that was something that Matthew just added on. But I think that, and that would then leave the king in the first part of the parable being like God, with this abundant grace. Okay, now I want to see how this can possibly relate to prayer. As a district and a circuit, we're building up to our 24 hours of prayer event in Onken, and we're going to use that to launch a year where we're thinking about praying. We're trying to become more of a praying district. So what does this parable teach us about prayer? I think firstly, it shows us the direction that prayer should take. Remember, the grace flowed abundantly from God to the servant, and that's how it works for us. We are receiving all the time an abundance of grace and beauty from God, 10,000 talents all the time. It's coming to us all the time. The question is, do we notice? The servant in the parable didn't really clock what had happened. He didn't really notice that he'd been forgiven. He didn't really notice that there was such an abundance of grace that everything that went before, all his little petty debts, were meaningless now. The servant didn't notice. And I think a good way to think about prayer is simply noticing. Noticing that God is pouring out abundant love. God is present. God is blessing us all the time, every second, with beauty all around. Our job as prayers is to notice. It's not so much about what we direct to God, It's about being open to what God's doing to us. It's a bit like radio. The radio stations broadcast their programs all the time, 24 hours a day, washing over us all the time. When you have a radio, you choose. Do you tune in, or do you detune it, or do you turn it off? So, as a prayer, I think one way to think about prayer is just simply tuning in a radio and listening and watching what's going on all around us. And that's something that we can do all the time. It's not something that you have to do in a special place or at a special time. It's more a state. It's a way we live. We live tuned in. You leave your radio on all the time. In the last week's video, I slipped in a little song lyric. I can do the same again today. One of my favourite songs has the line, "He buzzes like a fridge, he's like a detuned radio." So may you be like a tuned radio, a prayer who notices the abundant grace of God poured out every second of every day. Thanks for watching, listening. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.